Don't do what I did. Don't go around thinking that if you're not using full manual mode that you're a terrible photographer. Don't be afraid to play with the modes that the camera offers you. It's a little better. This is just a video. I'm so at making videos. This is essentially a video about not trying to run before you can walk. This is my camera that I bought. It is a Sony a6000 and it's an excellent piece of kit. It cost me around £500 and this is my first semi-professional, call it my first proper camera. I've been interested in photography ever since I was a young teen, but never really bothered to purchase any decent equipment. So this was my introduction into a camera with some good level of manual settings. I've actually written some notes here, and essentially what I want to talk about in this video is for newcomers to camera equipment and people who are just trying to get to grips with a camera that has manual settings. Three things I want to talk about are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The aperture is essentially how wide the hole is on the lens, which allows the light to hit the sensor of the camera. Obviously, the bigger the hole, the more light can hit the sensor. The smaller the hole, the less light can hit the sensor. I'm not going to go into the details of how to mess with aperture to get different effects here, because you can find many videos online which discuss that. Shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open, which determines how long the light has to hit the sensor. So if you've got a smaller shutter speed, the shutter will click. It's a very short amount of time that the light is able to go through. The longer the shutter speed, which would be like click, click, the longer the amount of time the light has to go through and hit the sensor. And thirdly is ISO. ISO is a method of lightening or darkening an image, but it's non-mechanical, so it's nothing that you can physically do by altering the way the camera works via opening or shutting the aperture or increasing or decreasing the shutter speed. The higher the ISO, the more grainy your image is likely to be. So there is a bit of a what's the word? I think it's a case of diminishing returns, where if if you've got a dark image and you just boost the ISO, then you might get a lighter image so you can see what's going on, but your image is going to suffer with the amount of grain that's in it. And that's essentially the basics. Aperture, how big the hole is that lets light in. Shutter speed, how long the shutter is open so that the light can get to the sensor. And ISO is kind of like a non-mechanical way of increasing or decreasing the brightness of an image. When I first got this camera, I assumed that if I wasn't shooting in manual mode and taking responsibility for all of these three settings, then I wasn't a real photographer and I didn't really know what I was doing. So in manual mode, you get to determine each of these three settings yourself. So you can increase the aperture, increase the shutter speed, decrease both of them, increase or decrease the ISO, to essentially make the image exactly how you want it, which is fantastic if you've got a good grasp of how these things work in conjunction with each other. It just allows you to manipulate the camera to get the image that you want. However, if you're not well versed in these three settings, it is easy to get things wrong, and that's what I found I did. Basically, Sean and I went to Munich a few weeks ago and I was shooting the entire time on manual mode. The place was covered in snow and I wasn't a good enough photographer to understand how shooting in snow affects the image. So everything came out a little bit washed out, a little bit devoid of colour, and I wasn't particularly very happy with the results I got. So, since getting back from Munich and playing with the camera a little bit more at home, I decided to look into the other modes. Now, I've come to realise there's no shame in using the other modes that the camera offers you. It doesn't mean you're any less of a photographer. Essentially, you could be a photographer with an iPhone, providing you've got a good eye for an image. In Shutter Priority on a Sony a6000, Shutter Priority allows you to control the length of time that the shutter is open. When you go for a shorter length of time, so it'll go click like that, that's better for capturing images of motion. So say you throw the ball, your dog's about to catch the ball, you want to get a good photo of your dog catching the ball, set it to a very quick shutter speed, it will go click click, and then you'll get a frozen frame in time. If you choose a longer shutter speed, you're likely to get more of a blurred image. Not very good for action shots. Essentially, it might be good for landscapes. If you've got, say, a flowing waterfall and it's a beautiful landscape you want to take a picture of, set the shutter speed to a longer amount of time, which will increase the amount of time the light is able to hit the sensor, and you'll get a bit of like fluidity with the water rather than just a harsh click click image. This is also how you get things like light trails if you're shooting nighttime photography and there's cars moving by and you want those long lines of red lights and white lights from coming and going traffic. In Shutter Priority mode on the a6000, when you set the shutter speed to what you want, everything else is done by the the camera, so it intelligently figures out the best aperture and the best ISO to give you the best image. Along the same lines as that, if you go into aperture priority mode, which is the A on the camera underneath the S, that allows you to take control of the aperture so that you can either increase or decrease the size of the hole in the lens that lets the light through to the sensor, and then everything else is done by the camera. In aperture priority mode, once you set the aperture, the camera does everything else intelligently. It will edit the shutter speed and the ISO to give you the best image that it thinks you want. So since I really learned what aperture priority and shutter priority do, I've played about with it a bit, and I've found that the image quality that I'm getting is a lot better because the camera is being allowed to do what it does best. When you're not in a studio and you don't have time to hone the camera settings in manual mode, you don't want to miss shots, or you don't want to accidentally have your camera on the aperture that you want but neglect to remember to edit the shutter speed, and then you miss something. So yeah, essentially this is just for very beginner photographers. Don't do what I did. Don't go around thinking that if you're not using full manual mode that you're a terrible photographer, because you might end up, like I did, going to a foreign country and missing a bunch of good shots. Essentially, I just want to say, if you're new to this and you've got a decent camera like I've got now, but you still haven't fully got to grips with the way manual mode works, don't be afraid to play with the modes that the camera offers you. Aperture priority, shutter priority, whatever it is, just select which mode best fits your scene that you're trying to capture and let the camera do some of the work. I really like this camera. I think the only downfall I've noticed at the moment is the cost of lenses, because the next lens I want to get is around £300, and I'm not entirely sure where to go next. This is just the kit lens that came with the camera, and it's perfectly fine. I can get good images out of it, but I am eager to mess around with different lenses. That's just me being not as wealthy as I'd like to be able to afford the lenses. The only real issue I have with this is that the screen on the back flips out like this. You can see what you're doing. If you're shooting down low, you can flip it up, or if you're shooting up high, you can flip it down and see what you're doing, but it doesn't flip around to face the front. That's essentially the reason I'm not using this camera to film this video now, because when I'm filming, I like to be able to see what I'm doing on the screen and get a sense of how things are framed and whether I'm looking like a complete tool, which I should probably just get over, because that's what happens the majority of the time. Anyway, very brief introduction to the Sony a6000. Would definitely recommend it for somebody who's a beginner in photography who just wants to get to grips with things a bit more. I hope that was helpful. It certainly helped me to do a little bit of research and figure out exactly what shutter priority and aperture priority did on the Sony a6000, and just to play around with them a little bit more. This camera is full of features that I haven't yet experienced, but obviously as I go along, if I find anything interesting, I'll probably share them on here. If you've got a passion for photography, get a decent camera. They don't have to be too expensive. You don't have to spend thousands of pounds, but it's well worth it. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you for watching. Be well.